George Harmon, a 74-year-old Navy veteran, faces heartbreak when a private developer seizes his beloved lake, banning him from fishing. Once a community hero who fed the needy with his daily catch, George is now mocked online, his dignity shattered by a security guard's cruelty. As Milwater transforms into a luxury resort town, George's quiet resistance stirs something deeper. Who will stand for a man who gave everything to his town? And what secrets does the lake hold ready to surface? The stage is set for an unexpected reckoning that will change Milwater forever. Love stories of justice and resilience? Subscribe to Incredible Stories. Your support keeps tales like George's alive, honoring kindness and memory. Join our community, share, and help protect the voices that history might forget. Hit subscribe now and be part of something meaningful. The old man's hands trembled as he gripped his fishing rod, the worn wood smooth from decades of use, his knuckles pale against the morning chill. The security guard's voice sliced through the quiet dawn like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Cast that line one more time, and I'm calling the cops. Before George Harmon could respond, the guard lunged forward, yanking the rod from his weathered grasp with a force that sent a jolt of pain through the elderly fisherman's arms. The dock creaked beneath their feet, the only sound in the stunned silence that followed. No one on the shore stepped forward. No one uttered a word. The crowd, a mix of early risers and curious tourists, stood frozen, their eyes darting between the guard and the old man. George's faded navy cap slipped from his head, tumbling to the wooden planks like a discarded memory. He bent slowly, his knees protesting, to retrieve it, his fingers brushing the embroidered USS Liberty insignia. Clutching the broken rod, its splintered end dangling like a wounded limb, he turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched against the weight of humiliation. The dock seemed to stretch endlessly beneath his shuffling steps, each one heavier than the last, as if the lake itself were pulling him back. By the next morning, the lake was no longer quiet. Through the pre-dawn mist, sleek gray boats glided across the water, their engines humming with military precision. They moved in formation, silent and ominous, cutting through the foam like specters summoned from some forgotten past. Whispers rippled through Milwater. Who had called them? Why were they here? And why did the lake, now privatized and locked behind corporate gates, seem to stir with memories of the man who had once been its steward? George Harmon was 74, his face etched with lines as deep as the lake's hidden currents. Each wrinkle told a story, of sunrises watched from the deck of a Navy destroyer, of storms weathered at sea, of quiet mornings spent rowing his small wooden boat to the heart of Lakeside. Born in Milwater, a sleepy town cradled by water and pine, George had grown up casting nets with his father, learning the lake's moods like a language. After serving his country, he returned to the place where the water kissed the shore with a tenderness that felt like home. For 40 years, his routine had been unshakable. Rise before dawn, row out in his weathered skiff, and return with fish to share. He didn't fish for glory or gain. His catch fed the church's soup kitchen, the homeless shelter down by the old mill, and neighbors too frail to cast a line themselves. To Milwater, George was as constant as the tides, his silhouette against the dawn, a quiet promise that some things would never change. But Milwater had changed. The fishing and timber industries that once anchored the town had faded, replaced by tourism's glossy veneer. Where bait shops and hardware stores once stood, trendy cafes and boutiques now catered to weekenders from the city. The town's heart had shifted, its pulse quickened by strangers' wallets. Yet George remained, his navy cap faded but proud, a relic of a life spent serving others. He carried the lake in his bones, its rhythms woven into his soul. The trouble began when the town council, desperate to fill budget gaps, sold Lakeside and its surrounding parkland to Horizon Leisure Group. The developer's promises, luxury resorts, upscale dining, a revitalized economy, had dazzled the council. The deal was sealed in hushed meetings with little input from the people who called Milwater home. Overnight, the lake that had been everyone's became no one's, its shores cordoned off by signs proclaiming private property. On that crisp Tuesday morning, George arrived at his usual spot as the sky blushed with the first hints of dawn. His ancient pickup truck rattled to a stop, its bed cluttered with fishing gear that had seen better days. He adjusted his cap, the fabric soft from years of wear, and hauled his tackle box down the familiar path to the dock. The air was sharp, tinged with the earthy scent of autumn leaves and the faint mist rising from the lake. It felt alive, as if the water were whispering its secrets to an old friend. George unfolded his collapsible chair, its joints creaking like his own, and settled into the ritual that had grounded him for decades. Then came the voice, cold and abrupt. "Sir, this is private property. You need to leave. Now." George turned, his heart stuttering, to see a young security guard striding toward him. The man's uniform was crisp, the Horizon logo gleaming on his chest like a badge of conquest. His face was hard, unyielding, but his eyes flickered with unease, as if he sensed the weight of what he was doing. "I've been fishing here since before you were a thought in your mama's mind, son," George said, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his chest. He threaded his line with deliberate care, each motion a quiet act of defiance. The guard's jaw clenched. "Doesn't matter, the lake's under new management. No fishing without a permit from Horizon." George's hand dipped into his jacket, pulling out a worn card, its edges frayed from years of being carried close to his heart. It was a fishing exemption, granted by the old mayor in gratitude for George's tireless service to the town. "I've got permission," he said, holding it out, his voice soft but firm. The guard snatched the card, barely glancing at it before tearing it in two with a slow, deliberate rip. The sound cut through George like a knife. "This is worthless now, old man. New owners, new rules." The pieces of the card fluttered to the dock, and with them, something inside George seemed to fracture. His chest tightened, not with anger, but with a bone-deep sorrow. He thought of the lake, of the mornings it had held him through loss and loneliness, of the people who depended on his catch. He thought of his Navy days, when he'd stood tall for something bigger than himself. Now he was just an old man, stripped of the one thing that still gave his life meaning. The guard grabbed the rung, snapping it in his haste. George's cap fell as he reached for it, his fingers grasping at air. The crowd on the shore watched, some with phones raised, capturing the moment, not out of courage but curiosity. No one spoke for him. No one moved. George picked up his cap, dusted it off, and walked away, the broken rod cradled in his arms like a fallen comrade. His steps were heavy, each one a farewell to the lake that had been his sanctuary. The morning air hung heavy with the bite of early autumn, the kind that made your breath catch and your fingers stiffen around a fishing rod. George Harmon, 74 years old and weathered as the wooden dock beneath his boots, stood at the edge of Lakeside, his lake, the one he'd known since he was a boy. His hands, calloused from decades of nets and lines, gripped his rod tightly, as if it were an anchor, keeping him tethered to the world. The dawn was just breaking, painting the eastern sky in soft pinks and oranges, but the beauty of it was lost on George today. A voice, harsh and unfamiliar, shattered the stillness. "Cast that line again, and I'm calling the police." The security guard was young, barely out of his 20s, his face set in a mask of authority that didn't quite fit. His uniform, starched and new, bore the logo of Horizon Leisure Group, the company that had swooped into Milwater like a hawk claiming its prey. He stepped forward, his boots thudding against the dock, and ripped the rod from George's hands. The force sent a sharp pain through the old man's arm, but it was the violation of it, the theft of something so personal, that made his heart stutter. The rod, a gift from his father before he'd shipped off to the Navy, splintered in the guard's grip, the broken end dangling like a broken promise. George wanted to speak, to tell this boy about the lake, about the years he'd spent here, about the people who'd fed with its bounty, but the words caught in his throat, tangled with a rising tide of humiliation. The crowd on the shore, a mix of locals and tourists clutching their phones, stood silent. Their eyes darted between the guard and the old man, but no one moved. No one spoke. George's Navy cap, faded and threadbare, slipped from his head as he reached for the rod, landing on the dock like a piece of his dignity cast aside. He bent to retrieve it up, his knees protesting, his fingers trembling as they brushed the USS Liberty emblem. He clutched the broken rod to his chest, its weight heavier now, like a soldier's flag folded at a funeral, and turned away. Each step down the dock felt like a betrayal, as if the lake itself were watching him go, pleading for him to stay. By the next morning, the lake was transformed. Through the thick morning mist, sleek gray boats sliced through the water, their hulls gleaming with military precision. They moved in silent formation, engines humming low like a warning. In Milwater, whispers spread faster than the ripples on the water. Who had summoned these vessels? Why were they here, patrolling a lake now owned by a resort company? And why did it feel like the lake itself was stirring, remembering the man who had once belonged to it? George Harmon was a fixture in Milwater, as much a part of the town as the pine trees or the lake itself. His face, etched with lines from years at sea and mornings on the water, told a life of service. As a boy, he'd learned the lake's rhythms from his father, casting nets under starlit skies. After serving in the Navy, he'd come home to Milwater, to the gentle shore where water met land in a way that felt like a promise. For 40 years, he'd risen before dawn, rowing his small wooden skiff to the heart of Lakeside. He didn't fish for money or sport. His catch fed the church's soup kitchen, the homeless shelter, and neighbors too old to fend for themselves. To the people of Milwater, George was a quiet hero, his silhouette against the dawn a reminder of simpler days. But Milwater had changed around him. The fishing and timber industries that had once sustained the town had withered, replaced by tourism's shallow glitz. Bait shops and hardware stores had given way to coffee shops and boutiques, their bright signs catering to strangers with fat wallets. Yet George endured, his Navy cap a quiet badge of his service, his routine a small rebellion against a world that had left him behind. He carried the lake in his heart, its currents running through his veins, its quiet mornings a refuge for his soul. The crisis had begun when the town council, strapped for cash, sold Lakeside and its parkland to Horizon Leisure Group. The developer's vision, luxury resorts, fine dining, a polished paradise for the wealthy, had seduced them. The deal was done in secret, with little public input voice, leaving Milwater's residents stunned. The lake, once a shared treasure, was now private, its shores fenced off with signs that screamed private property. That Tuesday morning, George had arrived as he always did, his old pickup truck groaning as he pulled into his usual spot. He adjusted his cap, its fabric soft against his scalp, and carried his tackle box down the dock that had held his weight for decades. The air was crisp, the mist rising from the lake like a greeting from an old friend. He unfolded his chair, its creaking joints echoing his own, and prepared to cast his line, the ritual that had grounded him through grief and joy. Then came the guard's voice, cold as the morning air. "Sir, this is private property. You need to leave now." George's heart sank as he saw the young man approaching, his uniform a stark contrast to the lake's timeless beauty. "I've been fishing here since before you were born," George said softly, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of memory. He continued to prepare his line, each motion a quiet act of resistance. The guard's eyes narrowed, his patience thin. "That's irrelevant now. The lake's under new management. No fishing without a permit from Horizon." George reached into his jacket, his fingers closing around the dog-eared card he'd carried for years. A fishing exemption. A special permission granted by a mayor who'd known his worth to the town. "I've got permission," he said, holding it out, his voice tinged with a fragile pride. The guard took it, his eyes flicking over the faded text before he tore it in two with a slow, cruel precision that. The sound echoed in George's chest, a gunshot. "This means nothing now, old man," the guard said, his voice hard. "New owners, new rules." The card's pieces fell to the dock, and with them, George felt his world tilt. He thought of the lake, of the mornings it had held him, of the people who needed him. He thought of his Navy days, when he'd stood for something greater than himself. Now he was just an old man, stripped of the one thing that gave his life purpose. The guard grabbed his rod again, snapping it in his haste, and George's cap fell again as he reached for it. The crowd watched, some filming, none helping. George picked up his hat, dusted it off, and walked away, the broken rod cradled in his arms like a fallen brother. The lake, his sanctuary, was gone, and he was alone. The morning air hung heavy with the scent of lake water and pine. But for George, the familiar comfort of the dock was shattered by the sharp grip of the security guard's hand on his arm. Laughter rippled from the small crowd of onlookers, their voices a distant hum, like static on an old radio. George's heart thudded, not from fear, but from a quiet, simmering indignation. He was no stranger to being pushed around. Life had dealt him harder blows than this, but the casual cruelty of the moment stung. "Wait," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest, his eyes darting to the fishing rod leaning against the dock's weathered railing. It was more than just a tool, it was a tether to Margaret, his late wife, who had gifted it to him on their last anniversary before cancer claimed her. The memory of her smile, frail but radiant, flickered in his mind as he reached for it. The guard, a burly man with a face hardened by routine, shoved George with a force that felt personal, like a statement meant to echo beyond the moment. George stumbled, his knees barking against the rough planks of the dock. The fishing rod slipped from its perch, tumbling to the wood with a sickening crack that seemed to carry across the still water. The sound pierced George's chest, a fresh wound layered atop old grief. He froze, staring at the splintered remains of the rod, each piece a fragment of a life he'd clung to through years of loss. "Consider that your warning," the guard barked, his voice loud enough to ensure the crowd heard, his tone laced with a smug authority that made George's jaw tighten. He didn't respond, not because he lacked the words, but because he refused to give the guard the satisfaction of seeing him break. As he knelt to gather the broken pieces, George's fingers moved with the tenderness that belied his weathered hands. Each shard of the rod was handled as if it were sacred, like the flag he'd once folded at a comrade's funeral, precise and reverent. The crowd, morning joggers in sleek athletic wear, dog walkers with their leashes taut, and curious passers-by, watched in silence. Their faces were a mix of discomfort and detachment, some filming the scene with their phones, others whispering to companions. Not one stepped forward to defend him. The weight of their indifference pressed against George's chest, heavier than the guard's shove. He could feel their eyes, judging, dismissing, as if he were a relic out of place in their polished, modern world. A young man in expensive running gear, his voice sharp with entitlement, broke the quiet. "About time they cleaned this place up," he said to his friend, loud enough for George to hear. "That old guy's been squatting on prime real estate for years." The words cut, not because they were true. George had fished this lake legally with permits for decades, but because they reduced him to nothing more than an obstacle to progress. He wanted to turn, to meet the young man's eyes, and tell him about the mornings he'd spent here with Margaret, casting lines and sharing quiet dreams. But he didn't. Instead, he rose, the broken rod tucked under his arm, and walked toward his truck with a dignity that felt like it belonged to a different time, a time when respect wasn't measured by property values. Behind him, the guard was already hammering "no fishing private property" signs into the dock, each strike a nail in the coffin of the life George had known. The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting golden light across the lake, but it brought no warmth to George's heart. As he climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Construction vehicles were rolling in, their diesel engines growling like predators, claiming territory. This lake, once a sanctuary for him and Margaret, was being swallowed by the march of development. Condos, marinas, and glass-fronted cafes that would cater to people like the jogger, who saw no value in an old man's quiet rituals. What no one in the crowd noticed, as they fixated on the spectacle of George's humiliation, was the way his fingers instinctively folded the torn fishing permit with the precision of a soldier folding a flag. Nor did they see the way his eyes, before turning away from the water, scanned the horizon with the practiced vigilance of a man who had once stood watch on the deck of a naval ship, searching for enemies in the dark. Those moments of his past, when he'd faced storms and saved lives, were invisible to them, as was the weight of his loss. George's home, a modest cabin at the edge of the forest, was a world apart from the million-dollar lakefront properties springing up like weeds. He'd built it himself after returning from his Navy service, every nail driven with purpose, every beam a testament to his need for something solid in a world that kept shifting beneath him. The wooden walls were a gallery of his life, faded photographs of naval vessels cutting through stormy seas, certificates of commendation yellowed by time, and a shadow box holding service medals he never spoke of. To George, they weren't trophies but reminders of what he'd survived and what he'd lost. Inside, he set the broken fishing rod on the table, its splintered pieces a stark contrast to the polished wood. His hands, calloused from years of labor, trembled slightly as he opened the cedar chest that held his most cherished possessions. From it, he lifted a precisely folded American flag, the one that had draped Margaret's coffin 8 years ago. The fabric was soft but heavy with memory, each fold a moment of her laughter, her strength, her final days. Beside it lay a faded photograph of his unit aboard the USS Liberty, their faces young and defiant against the backdrop of a churning sea. George had been one of the few to survive when a storm off the Philippine coast in 1972 nearly tore their ship apart. He could still feel the icy water on his skin, the burn in his muscles as he secured lifelines that saved 3 of his shipmates from being swept away. That day had taught him to hold fast, to anchor himself when the world threatened to unravel. Now, sitting heavily in his armchair, George felt the weight of his 68 years settle into his bones. The cabin was quiet, save for the faint creak of the floorboards and the distant call of a loon on the lake. Through the window, he could see the forest stretching toward the water, its edges already being nibbled away by bulldozers. His chest tightened with a grief that wasn't just for Margaret or the rod, but for the life he'd carved out here, a life that was being erased as surely as the lake's shoreline. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was back on the deck of the Liberty, the wind howling, the sea raging, and him standing firm, refusing to let go. But this time, there were no lifelines to secure, no shipmates to save. There was only the quiet of his cabin and the certainty that the world he'd known was slipping away, leaving him to face the storm alone. The lake shimmered far off in the distance, its surface catching the late afternoon sun like a sheet of polished silver. To George, it might as well have been on the other side of the world, locked away behind invisible walls he could neither climb nor break. Day 14, he scrawled in his weathered leather journal, the same one he'd carried through his Navy years, its pages now brittle with time and memory. 14 days since they barred me from the lake. I've never felt so out of place in the town I've called home my whole life. The words poured out heavy with a sorrow he couldn't shake, a sense of betrayal that clung to him like damp clothes after a storm. This wasn't just about a body of water. It was about the rhythm of his existence, the pulse of a life tied to Milwater's shores. The lake's gentle lapping had been his lullaby, his compass, his church. Now it was silent to him, and the silence ached. His daughter's voice echoed in his mind, her calls from Phoenix growing more insistent lately. "It's time, Dad," she'd say, her tone a mix of love and frustration. "That town isn't yours anymore. Come be with us." Each time, George had deflected with a soft refusal, unable to find words to convey what Milwater meant to him. How could he explain that his roots weren't just in the soil, but woven into the very fabric of the lake's ecosystem? That its tides moved in time with his own heartbeat? To leave would be to sever a part of himself, to abandon the legacy he'd built alongside his late wife, Margaret, whose memory still lingered in every corner of this town. The thought of a sterile retirement community in Arizona, with its manicured lawns and endless card games, filled him with a quiet dread. He wasn't ready to trade his life's meaning for a condo and a golf cart. As dusk settled over Milwater, George flipped open his ancient phone, its screen so small it strained his eyes. What he found there hit him like a punch to the gut. His video, had spread across the internet like wildfire, racking up thousands of shares. There he was, standing at the lake's edge, arguing with the new owner's security team, his voice steady, but his face etched with disbelief. Someone had slapped cartoonish music over it, complete with captions that stung like salt in a wound. "Boomer can't read, no trespassing," and "old fish fights." New lake owners and loses. The comments below were a cesspool of cruelty. That generation thinks they own everything just because they've been around forever. Maybe if he'd invested in real estate instead of fish, he wouldn't be crying now. "Time to move to a retirement home, Grandpa. The world belongs to those who can pay for it." Each word twisted the knife deeper, turning his private pain into public mockery. George felt his chest tighten, not with anger, but with a profound loneliness. These strangers didn't know him, didn't know the decades he'd poured into this town, the lives he'd touched. To them, he was just a punchline. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from the screen's glow. It was Bill Jenkins, the hardware store owner, one of the last old-timers still holding out against the tide of change sweeping Milwater. Bill's face was lined with the same weariness George felt, his eyes carrying the weight of a town slipping away. "Heard about the lake," Bill said, settling into a chair as George handed him a steaming mug of coffee. The aroma filled the small kitchen, a fleeting comfort. "It's a raw deal, George." George nodded, his voice calm but hollow. "It's their property now. They can do what they want." He meant it, or tried to. The truth was, accepting it felt like swallowing broken glass. The lake wasn't just land. It was a living thing, a partner in the life he'd built. To see it fenced off, privatized, turned into a playground for the wealthy, was a violation he couldn't articulate. Bill shifted in his seat, uneasy. "Town's changing, George. Maybe it's time to think about moving on." The words hung heavy, unfinished but clear. George's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "This is my home, Bill. I buried Margaret here. My whole life's in this soil." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the storm inside. Margaret's grave was just a mile away under the old oak where they'd picnicked as newlyweds. Leaving her, leaving this, was unthinkable. Every tree, every street, every ripple on that lake held a piece of their story. Bill sighed, his gaze dropping to the table. "I get it, but these developers, they've got the town council eating out of their hands. Word is, they're planning to turn the whole lakefront into some fancy members-only resort. Annual fees higher than what most folks here make in a month." George's heart sank further. A resort? The lake, once a haven for kids learning to cast their first lines, for families grilling on summer evenings, would be locked behind a paywall. "What's the town say about it?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Bill looked away, his voice low. "Most of the original families have sold out and left. The newcomers, they're all for it. They want their property values to keep climbing. Call it progress." The word landed like a curse. Progress. To George, it felt like erasure. Like the town was shedding its soul to make room for strangers who saw Milwater as a status symbol, not a community. After Bill left, George stepped onto his porch, the cool night air brushing against his face. The lake was invisible now, swallowed by darkness, but he could feel it out there calling to him. New security lights glared along the shore, their harsh beams slicing through the natural calm, a stark reminder of the barriers now in place. George's mind drifted to brighter days, mornings spent teaching local kids to fish, their laughter echoing as they reeled in their first catch. He'd shown them how to respect the water, to treat its creatures with care. He thought of the fish fries that had fed half the town, the widows who'd smiled gratefully when he dropped off his weekly hauls, the mayors who'd shaken his hand for keeping the food pantry stocked. Those moments were the threads of his life, woven into Milwater's history. Now, with a single signature, that history had been erased, the lake reduced to a line on a developer's spreadsheet. His phone buzzed again, jarring him from his thoughts. It was his daughter, her voice thick with worry. "They sent me the video, Dad," she said. "This is exactly why I've been begging you to move here. That town doesn't deserve you anymore." George's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her everything, how the lake was more than water, how it held his past, his love, his purpose. Instead, he murmured, "It's just a misunderstanding, sweetheart." He couldn't bear to burden her with his grief, couldn't admit how lost he felt. "It's not," she pressed, her voice breaking. "They've forgotten who built that place, who kept it alive. Come to Phoenix, Dad. Let us take care of you." George stood silent, staring into the night, the lake's absence a wound that wouldn't heal. He didn't answer her, not yet. How could he choose between his heart and his home when they were one and the same? The weight of hard times pressed heavily on George Harmon's shoulders, a burden that seemed to deepen with each passing day. The lake, once a sanctuary of solace and sustenance, now bore the sting of change, its shores marked by the encroachment of private property signs. His daughter Ellen had urged him to consider leaving Milwater, her voice laced with a quiet worry that cut deeper than any storm. Maybe she had a point, George mused, though the thought of abandoning this place felt like severing a lifeline. As twilight surrendered to the full embrace of night, the lake shimmered faintly under a crescent moon, and George's mind wandered to the generations of Harmons who had called these waters home. His father, a man of few words but boundless patience, had guided his small hands to cast a fishing line for the first time, the memory vivid with the scent of damp earth and the soft lapping of waves. His grandfather, a pillar of the community, had poured his heart into founding Milwater's first fish market, a legacy that still lingered in the town's collective pride. "I'll think about it," George said to Ellen, his voice low and gravelly, though the words felt hollow. They both knew the truth. Leaving wasn't an option. Like the ancient oaks that lined the lake's edge, their roots gnarled deep into the soil, George was tethered to this place by something stronger than choice, by identity, by history, by the very pulse of his existence. He didn't want handouts or special privileges. All he craved was the simple right to cast his line into the waters that had shaped him, to feel the tug of a fish and the rhythm of a life he'd always known. The thought of being pushed out, of losing this sacred connection, stirred a quiet ache in his chest, a longing for a home that was slipping through his fingers. The next morning dawned with a rare, breathtaking clarity, the kind of autumn day that seemed to hold the world in a delicate, crystalline glow. The air was crisp, carrying the faint sweetness of fallen leaves, and the sky stretched endlessly blue, unmarred by a single cloud. George rose before the sun, as he had for decades, his body moving through the familiar ritual of brewing black coffee. He settled onto his porch, the worn wooden chair creaking beneath him, and cradled the steaming mug in his calloused hands. Without his daily pilgrimage to the lake, the early hours yawned before him, empty and disorienting. Fishing had been more than a livelihood. It was his anchor, his purpose, a quiet communion with the world. Now, stripped of that routine, he felt adrift, the silence of the morning heavy with uncertainty. At exactly 7 o'clock a.m., a low, unmistakable rumble shattered the stillness, reverberating across the lake like a distant drum roll. George's head snapped up, his coffee forgotten as he set the mug on the porch railing. This wasn't the casual hum of recreational boats, the kind that dotted the water on lazy weekends. This sound had weight, authority, a mechanical growl that spoke of purpose. Curiosity tugged at him, overriding the reluctance that had kept him from the shore since his last encounter with the security guard. He rose, his joints protesting faintly, and made his way toward the water, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The lake glittered in the morning light, but George's eyes were fixed on the horizon, where something extraordinary was unfolding. What he saw stopped him cold. 8 naval rigid-hull inflatable boats, their sleek forms cutting through the water, advanced in flawless formation toward Milwater's main dock. American flags fluttered proudly at their sterns, snapping in the breeze, and each vessel carried personnel in crisp Navy service dress blues, their uniforms immaculate as if prepared for a formal ceremony. The sight was so unexpected, so out of place in the sleepy rhythm of Milwater, that George felt a jolt of disbelief, his heart quickening with a mix of awe and apprehension. The town stirred to life around him, doors swinging open as residents spilled out of homes and shops, drawn by the unusual commotion. Construction workers at the new development site paused, their machinery falling silent, and even the security guard who had barred George's way the day before stood frozen at the dock's entrance, his radio pressed to his lips, but his expression one of utter confusion. The lead boat docked with surgical precision, its crew moving with practiced efficiency. From it stepped a tall, silver-haired man whose presence commanded immediate attention. His posture was erect, his movements deliberate, and the insignia on his uniform marked him as a retired Navy colonel. Samuel Everett's eyes swept over the growing crowd, sharp and assessing, until they landed on George, who stood apart, his weathered face etched with cautious curiosity. "Tension!" Everett's voice rang out, clear and commanding, and every sailor on the boat snapped to perfect posture, their discipline a stark contrast to the townsfolk's bewildered murmurs. The colonel stepped forward, his boots echoing softly on the dock, and addressed the crowd in a voice that carried effortlessly across the water. My name is Colonel Samuel Everett, United States Navy, retired. His words held a quiet gravitas, each syllable imbued with the weight of experience. 42 years ago, during the storm that claimed the USS Liberty, Chief Petty Officer George Harmon saved 12 men from my unit, carrying the intrepid through treacherous waters to safety. A ripple of surprise passed through the onlookers, their gazes shifting to George, who stood rooted to the spot, his throat tightening with a flood of memories he'd long buried. The storm, the K, the faces of men clinging to life, they surged back, vivid and unrelenting, stirring a complex swirl of pride and pain. Everett continued, his voice steady but warm with respect. What many of you may not know is that after his honorable discharge, George Harmon never stopped serving. During the flood of '89, he used his boat to evacuate 27 residents from the eastern shore, risking his own safety to ensure theirs. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, tinged with admiration and disbelief. Neighbors who had known George as the quiet fisherman, the man who kept to himself, now saw him through a new lens, their eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and astonishment. George felt their stares, heavy and unfamiliar, and fought the urge to look away. He hadn't done those things for recognition. They were simply what needed to be done. Yet standing there under the weight of their gaze and Everett's words, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't acknowledged in years, a quiet, enduring pride in the life he'd lived. The sun beat down on the cracked, parched shore of Lake Milwater, where the drought of '95 had left its mark on both the land and the people. George Harmon stood at the water's edge, his weathered hands clutching a fishing pole, his eyes tracing the ripples that spread across the lake's surface. Back in '95, when wells ran dry and contamination seeped into the groundwater, George had been a quiet savior. He'd spent sleepless nights installing water purification systems for families who faced the terror of tainted water, their faces etched with gratitude and desperation. For 40 years, he'd risen before dawn, collecting water samples and meticulously recording data that the Environmental Protection Agency leaned on for their regional reports. His work was a silent vow to protect this town, a promise he'd kept without fanfare or expectation of reward. The lake wasn't just water to George, it was a living testament to his life's purpose, a mirror reflecting his unyielding commitment. From a nearby boat, a younger man stepped onto the dock, his Navy uniform crisp despite the heat. Lieutenant Commander James Wilson carried himself with a quiet intensity, his chest tight with a debt he could never fully repay. "My name is James Wilson," he announced, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I'm standing here today because George Harmon saved my father's life. During the chaos of Saigon's final evacuation, when gunfire tore through the air and hope seemed lost, George carried my father to safety on his back, shielding him from the bullets that sought to end them both." James paused, his throat tightening as he recalled the stories his father had told him, the weight of that moment etched into their family's history. Years later, when my father couldn't afford to send me to college, it was George, without ever revealing his name, who created a scholarship fund for veterans' children in this county. He gave me a future when I had none. His gaze settled on George, who stood motionless, the faintest tremor in his hands betraying the storm of emotions beneath his stoic exterior. "I'm here because George Harmon gave everything for others and asked for nothing in return." The crowd stirred as a man pushed through, his clipboard clutched like a shield. The manager from Horizon Leisure Group, with his pressed suit and impatient demeanor, scanned the gathering with a frown. "This is a private event space now," he began, his tone sharp with authority. "You can't just—" His words were cut off by a woman stepping from a third boat, her dark suit formal and her expression unyielding. Amanda Richards from the Department of Interior carried the weight of federal authority in her steady gaze. "Actually, you can't," she said, her voice slicing through the manager's protest. "This lake is protected under the National Historical Waterways Protection Act, designated for its documented use by 3 Native American tribes." She held up a document, its official seal glinting in the sunlight. "As of 0600 this morning, all development here is suspended pending a full environmental and historical review. The sale of this land was approved without the required federal assessment, and that oversight ends now." Her words landed like a gavel, and the manager's face paled, his clipboard suddenly seeming inadequate. The security guard who had earlier torn George's permit in a show of petty power shifted uncomfortably, his bravado crumbling. A sailor approached him, holding a folded sheet of paper with deliberate calm. "This," the sailor said, "is a copy of George Harmon's original agreement with the town of Milwater, dated 1983. The guard took the pier, his hands unsteady. "It grants George lifetime fishing rights in exchange for his voluntary environmental monitoring services. This contract is recognized by federal law and supersedes any change in ownership." The sailor's tone was firm but not unkind, as if offering the guard a chance to understand the gravity of his mistake. The crowd, once buzzing with tension, began to shift. Camera phones, initially raised to mock or challenge, now captured the scene with a reverence that spread like wildfire. The hashtag George Harmon Day was already trending across Milwater's social media, a digital ripple mirroring the lake's quiet waves. The veterans, prepared and resolute, moved with purpose. They erected a modest memorial on the shoreline, a simple plaque honoring the USS Liberty and George's decades of service, both in the Navy and to this small town. Its words were plain but profound, a testament to a man who had never sought the spotlight. The veterans formed an honor guard along the dock, their uniforms a silent tribute as they created a path to George's usual fishing spot. Each step they took was heavy with respect, their faces reflecting memories of battles fought and debts owed. Colonel Everett, his hair silvered but his posture still commanding, approached George, who had remained silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "The men and women here represent 4 generations of sailors who know what honor looks like," Everett said, his voice steady but warm. "We heard what happened, George. Word travels fast among us." He extended his hand, and George gripped it tightly, the contact a lifeline to a past they both carried. Emotion flickered across George's face, threatening to crack the calm he'd worn like armor. "You didn't have to come all this way, Sam," he said, his voice low, almost breaking. Everett's reply was simple, unwavering. "Yes, we did. Milwater doesn't get to erase what you've done. Not for us, not for this town." The crowd swelled as news of the standoff spread through Milwater like a summer storm. Faces from the town council appeared, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and unease as they realized the depth of their error. They had underestimated George, dismissed his quiet contributions, and now stood exposed under the weight of their misjudgment. The mayor arrived last, his tie askew, his hurried steps betraying his unease. He made his way to an improvised podium, a makeshift platform that had sprung up amid the gathering. "On behalf of Milwater," he began, his voice faltering as he glanced between the veterans, the developers, and Amanda Richards, whose documents still hung in the air like a sword. His words were cautious, tinged with the realization that the town's gratitude for George had been too long unspoken. And now, under the gaze of a community awakened, he had no choice but to acknowledge it. The representative stood at the podium, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a decision long overdue. "I'm here to announce an immediate review of the lake sale contract," he declared, his words cutting through the murmurs of the gathered crowd. "Furthermore, we're establishing a permanent veterans landing zone on the eastern shore, with guaranteed public access and a special recognition of George Harmon's lifetime fishing rights." He reached into his jacket, producing a freshly laminated permit, its edges crisp and gleaming under the morning sun. He extended it toward George, who stood a few feet away, his weathered hands clasped loosely in front of him. George accepted the permit with a quiet nod, his face betraying no hint of the storm of emotions swirling within him. Pride, yes, but also a deep unease at being the center of attention, a role he'd never sought. What no one could capture, not the local reporters scribbling notes, nor the smartphones recording every word, was the profound shift in how the people of Milwater now saw George. For years, he'd been the old man at the edge of town, a relic of a fading era, his solitary figure on the dock as familiar as the sunrise but just as overlooked. There had been an invisible wall between him and the community, built from whispers of his stubbornness, his refusal to bend to the developer's offers, his quiet defiance of a world that measured worth in dollars and progress. But now that wall had crumbled. In its place stood a new respect, a recognition that some values, loyalty to the land, to memory, to a way of life, couldn't be quantified in economic reports or property appraisals. George felt it in the glances cast his way, no longer pitying or dismissive, but warm, almost reverent. It unsettled him as much as it warmed his heart. As the formalities drew to a close, George did something that caught everyone off guard. Without a word, he turned and walked to his battered pickup truck, its paint chipped from years of salty air. From the bed, he retrieved his spare fishing rod, an old but sturdy relic of countless mornings on the water. He returned to the dock, his steps deliberate, his eyes fixed on the horizon. With the ease of a man who had performed this ritual since boyhood, he baited his hook, cast his line into the glassy water, and sat. The crowd watched, hushed, as if witnessing something sacred. One by one, the veterans in attendance, men and women who had seen their own battles, fought in distant lands or within their own minds, joined him. They settled along the dock, their silence a testament to a shared understanding. No grand speeches were needed, no proclamations of victory. This was their communion, a quiet solidarity forged not in words, but in the simple, stubborn act of being present, of persisting. The week after what the townsfolk began calling Navy Day brought changes to Milwater that no one could have foreseen. George's story, a tale of one man's quiet stand against the encroaching tide of development, had spread like wildfire. National news outlets picked it up, framing it as a modern David versus Goliath, a lone fisherman against the might of Horizon Leisure Group. The company, battered by a public relations disaster and looming legal scrutiny from the Department of the Interior, issued a statement that they were reevaluating their plans, promising to honor the area's cultural and historical roots. George read the headlines with a mix of skepticism and quiet satisfaction, knowing that words from corporate offices often meant less than the actions that followed. Still, the shift felt real, like a tide turning. A small ceremony was held a few days later to dedicate the eastern dock as George's Landing, keeper of the waters. The sign, carved by a local woodworker with calloused hands and a reverence for the task, was understated yet dignified, much like George himself. He attended reluctantly, uncomfortable with the fuss, but understanding its deeper meaning. This wasn't just about him. It was about setting a precedent, a marker for what Milwater valued. Its history, its people, its connection to the water that had shaped them all. As he stood there, the breeze tugging at his worn jacket, he felt a quiet pride, not for himself but for the community that had finally seen what he'd always known. What truly brought light to George's days, however, were the children. They started showing up at the dock in the mornings, their small faces bright with curiosity about the old man from the viral video. At first they came to gawk, but soon their interest deepened, drawn by the calm authority in his movements, the way he seemed to speak to the water itself. George welcomed them with the same patience he'd once shown young sailors during his Navy days, teaching them how to tie a perfect knot, how to read the ripples on the water's surface for signs of fish below, how to sit in stillness until the moment was right. He found himself smiling more, his heart lighter than it had been in years, as he watched their small hands fumble with fishing lines, their eyes wide with wonder. One morning, a young girl with pigtails and a serious expression struggled to bait her hook, her fingers slipping on the wriggling worm. "Do you ever get scared of the water?" she asked, her voice small but direct. George paused, his hand steadying hers as he helped secure the bait. His mind flickered to a night decades ago, a storm that had torn his ship apart, the icy water closing over him as he fought to survive. "I was terrified once," he admitted, his voice low, "when I was under it, during a storm that took my ship. But sitting beside it, watching over it, never." The girl tilted her head, her brow furrowed. "Because you're friends?" she asked, her bluntness pulling a rare chuckle from him. "Because we understand each other," he said, his gaze drifting to the water. "The water remembers everything it touches. It was here before us, and it'll be here long after. The trick is learning to listen to what it's trying to tell you." She nodded, her small face thoughtful, as if he'd shared a secret about the world that she'd always suspected but never known how to name. George watched her cast her line, her movements clumsy but determined, and felt a quiet certainty that the water would teach her too in time. The sun had barely crested the horizon when George trudged down the familiar dirt path to his favorite spot by the lake. his boots crunching softly against the gravel. His heart carried a quiet ache, a suspicion that had been brewing for weeks. The security guard, who had so callously ripped up his fishing permit, a document George had carried like a badge of honor, had vanished from his post. No explanation, no farewell, just gone. George didn't dwell on it, but the absence gnawed at him, a reminder of how quickly things could change, how easily people could dismiss what mattered to him. Yet, on this crisp morning, as he approached his weathered bench by the water's edge, something new caught his eye. There, placed with deliberate care, sat a pristine USS Liberty cap, its navy blue fabric crisp and untouched, the gold embroidery glinting like a promise in the dawn's light. George stood still, his weathered hands tightening around the strap of his fishing bag. The cap wasn't just an object. It felt like a silent confession, an apology woven into the stiff folds of fabric. His chest tightened with a mix of gratitude and wariness. Who had left it? The guard? Someone else who knew what that permit had meant to him? He reached out, his fingers brushing the cap's brim, feeling the unfamiliar texture of something new in a life so steeped in routine. For a moment, he imagined wearing it, the weight of it settling on his head, a symbol of reconciliation. But the thought passed. His old faded cap, worn soft by years of sun and sweat, felt like an extension of himself, a quiet rebellion against change. He set the new cap aside, arranging his fishing gear with the same meticulous care he always did, his heart settling into the rhythm of the lake. Some apologies didn't need words, he thought. Some were better left as gestures, their meaning sinking deep like a stone in still water. Meanwhile, in the town hall, Mayor Thompson sat at his polished desk, his fingers drumming nervously against a stack of papers. The controversy over the lake's development, had left him rattled, the political winds shifting beneath his feet like unstable ground. He'd felt the town's pulse, angry veterans, frustrated locals, and the growing murmur of discontent, and he knew he had to act. The idea of a Veterans Advisory Council had come to him late one night, born of both strategy and a flicker of genuine remorse. He'd seen George's quiet dignity by the lake, the way the old man carried himself with a steadiness that put the mayor's own ambitions to shame. When he approached George with the offer to join the council, he'd expected resistance, and he wasn't wrong. George's eyes had narrowed, his jaw tightening as if weighing the cost of stepping into a world of meetings and bureaucracy. But something in the mayor's earnest plea, perhaps the acknowledgement of past mistakes, softened George's resolve. Reluctantly, he agreed, though his heart remained tethered to the lake, not the council chamber. The council's first meeting was a quiet triumph. George sat at the table, his faded cap a stark contrast to the polished suits around him, his voice steady as he proposed allocating a portion of the town's tourism revenue to preserve public access to the lake and its surrounding lands. The idea wasn't just practical, it was a declaration that the natural heart of the town, the waters and woods that had sustained generations, wouldn't be sacrificed for luxury condos and marinas. The council's unanimous approval felt like a small victory, a nod to the values George had carried through decades of fishing and quiet observation. For the mayor, it was a chance to rebuild trust, to show the town he could listen. But for George, it was about ensuring the lake remained a place for everyone, not just the wealthy vacationers who saw it as a backdrop for their leisure. Colonel Everett's visits became a steady rhythm in George's life. The older man, his face lined with the weight of years and wars, would appear by the lake in the pre-dawn stillness, sometimes alone, sometimes with other veterans whose eyes carried the same quiet stories. They'd sit together on George's bench, the lake stretching out before them like a mirror of their thoughts. Their conversations were sparse, each word chosen with care, as if the silence between them held as much meaning as the words themselves. They spoke of the water, its clarity, its moods, how the seasons painted it in shifting hues of blue and gray. They shared observations about the herons that stalked the shallows or the way the wind carried the scent of pine. For Everett, these moments were a tether to something unchanging, a refuge from a world that seemed to spin faster every year. For George, they were a reminder that he wasn't alone in his reverence for the lake, that others saw its timelessness too. One morning, as the sky glowed pink and the air held the bite of early fall, Everett mentioned the plans for the western shore. They're still pushing for it, he said, his voice low, almost resigned. Luxury condos, a marina, the whole deal. George didn't look up from his fishing line, his fingers deftly adjusting the tension. The news wasn't a surprise, but it settled heavy in his chest like a storm cloud on the horizon. Change comes whether we like it or not, he said finally, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet grief. What matters is holding on to what's worth keeping. Everett nodded, his eyes fixed on the water. Like you, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Still here, holding your ground. George shook his head, his gaze softening as he watched a ripple spread across the lake. Not me, he corrected gently. The water. I'm just passing through, same as everyone. But what we do while we're here, that's what counts. The lake itself seemed untouched by the human dramas unfolding along its shores. Its surface reflected the sky with the same indifference it had for centuries, its ripples dancing with the breeze, its depths yielding fish to those who knew how to wait. To George, it was a constant, a living thing that had seen empires rise and fall, towns grow and change, yet remained itself. Its serenity was a quiet rebuke to the plans for condos and marinas, a reminder that some things endured beyond human ambition. In early spring, nearly 6 months after the Navy day that had sparked so much tension, George arrived at his bench to find an unexpected sight. A gaggle of elementary school students, their clipboards clutched tightly, their eyes wide with curiosity. Their teacher, a young woman with an earnest smile, explained that they were studying the lake's ecosystem for a year-long science project. They'd heard of George, his decades of fishing, his meticulous notebooks, and hoped he'd share what he knew. George felt a flicker of self-consciousness, his weathered hands suddenly feeling too rough, too ordinary for such a task. But the children's eager faces pulled him in, their questions tumbling out like pebbles into the water. What followed was a morning George would carry with him for years. He knelt by the shore, showing them how to test the water's clarity with a simple Secchi disc, explaining how the lake's health could be read in its subtle shifts. He pointed out the silvery flash of a bass, the sluggish glide of a catfish, teaching them to recognize each species by its shape and movement. He showed them the signs of stress in the ecosystem, the algae blooms that hinted at runoff, the absence of certain insects that once thrived. The children scribbled furiously, their awe palpable, as if George had opened a book no textbook could match. The teacher, beaming, told them how George's notebooks, filled with decades of daily observations, were now aiding scientists tracking climate changes in the region. Mr. Harmon's been doing this longer than the EPA, she said, her voice proud. One boy, his face scrunched with curiosity, raised his hand. But you're not a scientist, he said, his bluntness cutting through the morning air. George chuckled, the sound low and warm. No, he admitted, his eyes crinkling. I'm just someone who's been paying attention for a long, long time. The words hung between them, simple but heavy with meaning. As the children left, their voices fading into the trees, George felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. His medals tucked away in a cedar chest at home were just metal and ribbon. But this, passing on what he'd learned, ensuring the lake's story would live on in those young minds, felt like a legacy worth leaving. George, now affectionately called Doc by the locals, had spent a lifetime tethered to the lake's edge, his weathered hands casting lines into the water with a rhythm as steady as the tides. His wisdom wasn't born from books or lectures, but from the quiet, persistent act of showing up, day after day, to observe the world around him. Every sunrise that painted the lake's surface in hues of gold and pink, every ripple stirred by a passing breeze, every fish that tugged at his line, these were the chapters of his education. In a world obsessed with algorithms and predictive models, where people sought answers in screens and spreadsheets, George stood as a quiet testament to something older, something primal. He believed in the irreplaceable power of simply being there, of watching the world unfold with patient, unwavering eyes. To him, the lake wasn't just water. It was a living story, one he'd spent decades reading, line by line, ripple by ripple. His heart held a deep reverence for the lake, a connection that ran deeper than nostalgia. It was as if the water had seeped into his soul, carrying with it the weight of countless mornings spent in solitude, reflecting on the slow dance of nature. George felt the lake's moods, its calm serenity on still summer days, its restless churn during autumn storms, and he carried those moods within him, a silent archive of moments no computer could ever replicate. There was a quiet pride in his chest, not boastful but steady, in knowing he'd been faithful to this place. He'd seen the herons stab at the shallows, watched the seasons turn the trees from green to fire to bare, and noted the subtle shifts in the lake's shoreline as time carved its gentle marks. To George, this wasn't just observation. It was devotion, a sacred act of bearing witness to a world that asked nothing of him but his presence. When the plans for the luxury development on the western shore first surfaced, George felt a pang in his chest, a mix of resignation and quiet defiance. He wasn't naive. He knew change was inevitable, that the world spun forward whether he willed it or not. But the thought of sleek, modern buildings crowding out his view of the lake stirred a deep unease. He didn't hate progress, but he mourned the possibility that the lake's quiet wisdom might be drowned out by the clamor of construction and the ambitions of those who saw the water only as a backdrop for their wealth. Still, when the development went ahead, smaller than planned, a compromise that left some of the shoreline untouched, George didn't let bitterness take root. From his fishing spot, he could see the new buildings rising, their glass facades catching the lake's reflection like mirrors. The sight stirred a complex emotion in him, a blend of acceptance and a faint hope that these newcomers might come to understand the lake as he did. The new residents, with their polished cars and expensive tastes, had been drawn to the lake for the same reasons George had stayed all these years. Its beauty was undeniable, a shimmering promise of peace that called to something deep within the human spirit. He didn't resent them for coming, didn't see them as intruders. In his heart, he held a quiet wish that they too might learn the lake's lessons. Perhaps, in time, they'd sit by its edge and feel the weight of its stillness, the way it seemed to hold time itself in its depths. Maybe they'd come to see that the lake's true value wasn't in its scenic views or its potential for profit, but in the way it invited you to belong to it, to let its rhythms become your own, to let its quiet beauty reshape your soul. George often thought about the people who passed through life without ever finding a place to anchor themselves. He'd seen them come and go, chasing fleeting pleasures or ambitions, never pausing long enough to let a place claim them. He was different. He'd chosen to stay, to sit in the same spot year after year, holding fast to the lake, even as others moved on, chasing newer, shinier things. There was a kind of poetry in that, he thought, a quiet dignity in choosing to remain when the world seemed to demand constant motion. But he also knew the world didn't always value people like him. Only when they were pushed aside by progress or time did people realize the void they left behind. A man like George, with his weathered cap and his fishing rod, might seem replaceable to those who didn't know better. But the lake knew. It knew the weight of his presence, the depth of his loyalty. This story of George and his lake might slip from your mind in a few days, carried away by the rush of daily life. But if no one remembers to tell it, if no one pauses to honor the quiet devotion of people like him, then history itself risks falling silent. The world needs stories like these, stories of justice, of kindness, of memory held close until the very end. They remind us to slow down, to look, to belong.